A black executive boarded a first-class flight, just trying to get home to his daughter. But within minutes a flight attendant accused him of theft without any proof. Security dragged him out like a criminal, and 7 minutes later she was fired on the spot. What happened in between will shake you. Stay with me. This is more than a flight, this is a reckoning. Before we begin, comment below and let us know where in the world you're watching this from. And if this story strikes something in you, hit subscribe for more powerful true stories. It was just an ordinary flight, or at least that's how it was supposed to be. Marcus Harris stepped through the glass jetway of Gate A23, a sleek navy duffel in one hand and a black coat folded neatly over the other. The overhead lighting buzzed faintly above him, casting sharp lines across the polished airport tiles. He had boarded countless flights like this before, cities blurring into each other across time zones and hotel rooms, but today felt different. Not because of the destination, it was home. New York. But because of what waited there. His daughter's drawing taped to the fridge, her warm cheek against his beard when he picked her up, and the bedtime story she always insisted he finish, even when his voice cracked from exhaustion. His stride was confident, but not arrogant. Purposeful, not aggressive. Years of experience in boardrooms had taught him that people don't just listen to your words, they watch how you move through a room. Or in this case, a cabin. He paused just before the first-class curtain, pulled out his phone, and scrolled briefly through a text from Jada's nanny. She's excited to see you. She drew something special again. A small smile tugged at his lips. As he stepped into the first-class section, the hush was immediate, luxurious. The kind of silence that came not from calm, but from curated comfort. Soft leather seats, silver champagne buckets, and the subtle scent of over-polished walnut trim. He nodded politely to the flight attendant by the galley, a woman with sharp features and a name tag that read Rebecca. She didn't nod back. Her gaze moved over him like a barcode scanner, momentarily still calculating. He'd seen it before, in bank lobbies, in high-end stores, even in executive lounges. The pause. The flicker of a silent question that never had to be spoken aloud. What are you doing here? Marcus offered her a courteous smile anyway, unbothered outwardly. He moved to seat 2A, stowed his briefcase overhead, and slid into his seat, letting his breath finally slow. The click of his belt was oddly loud in the quiet cabin. He unfolded his tablet, adjusted the cuff of his shirt, and that's when it happened. "Sir," Rebecca said, voice smooth but tight, like a violin string pulled one note too far. "May I see your boarding pass?" Marcus looked up, not rudely, just surprised. "Is there an issue?" She gave a smile too small to mean anything real. "Just standard procedure." He blinked. "Sure." He handed her the ticket without another word. She scanned it, hesitated, then handed it back with a clipped nod. "You're in the right seat." "I know," he said, not smug, just factual. He didn't say what he was thinking. "You watched 5 other passengers walk past you without checking a single one. You didn't check the man in 2B, whose coat smells like cigar ash and arrogance. You didn't ask the woman in 1C who's already sipping champagne. Just me." Rebecca moved on, but something lingered in the air, unspoken but felt. A shift in gravity. 5 minutes passed. She returned, under the guise of adjusting the curtain that divided first class from business. But she wasn't looking at the fabric. Her eyes found Marcus again. He shifted slightly, trying to ignore it. He opened a document on his tablet, a quarterly report, dry, familiar. But then a gasp cut through the quiet. "My watch," a woman in 1C said, voice rising. "It's gone. It was right here." Rebecca swooped in with theatrical concern. "A watch, ma'am?" "Yes. My Cartier. Rose gold. I took it off to sanitize my hands and left it on the tray. I went to the restroom and now it's gone." "Don't worry," Rebecca said quickly. "We'll get to the bottom of it." Her eyes snapped to Marcus like a reflex. She didn't ask anyone else. She walked directly to him. "Sir, would you mind standing up for a moment?" Marcus closed his tablet slowly. "Excuse me?" "We've had a report of a missing item," she said, her voice suddenly efficient. "It's best if we check the area." "So check the area," he said calmly, not moving. "But why am I the only one you're asking to stand?" "This is not an accusation," she replied too quickly. "Just a precaution." "For whom?" he asked, his voice steady. "Because I'm the only black man in first class." The air went razor thin. Passengers turned. Rebecca stiffened, as though aware of being watched. She faltered for just a moment, then recovered. "Sir, if you don't cooperate, I'll have to involve the captain." Marcus leaned back slightly, voice low. "Please do." Let's make this as public as possible. Rebecca's jaw twitched. Another flight attendant appeared, Melissa, younger, less certain. She whispered something to Rebecca. Rebecca's nostrils flared. Fine, she muttered. We'll return to this. But it had already happened. The suggestion had been made. The seed of suspicion had been planted. The woman in 1C looked at Marcus differently now. So did the man across the aisle who subtly slid his laptop a little closer to himself. Marcus sat perfectly still. Hands folded. Jaw set. He was not shocked. Only tired. Across the aisle, a male attendant named Caleb whispered urgently into Rebecca's ear. She disappeared behind the curtain. Moments later, she re-emerged, flanked by 2 uniformed security personnel. Their presence was not loud, but it screamed through the silence. The taller one spoke. Sir, he said, calm but firm. We've received a report of a missing item. We'd like to ask you to step off the plane for a quick conversation. Marcus didn't blink. No one else was asked to step off. No one else was searched. Why me? This is just procedure, the officer said, clearly uneasy. Funny how procedure always seems to follow me, Marcus replied, and then, slowly, he stood. Deliberately. Gracefully. No sudden movements. Phones began to record, quietly. A young woman in 1B tilted her phone, just enough to capture the scene. Rebecca spotted it. Ma'am, I'll have to ask you to stop recording. It's against FAA regulations. No, it's not, the woman said. I know my rights. Rebecca stepped forward, her voice sharp. I'm authorized to ask you to delete that video. You're not worried about safety, the woman said. You're worried about going viral. Marcus gave her the smallest nod of gratitude. He reached up, removed his carry-on, and prepared to follow the officers down the aisle. And as he did, a middle-aged man in 3A muttered under his breath, If you've got nothing to hide, why not just cooperate? Marcus turned his head slightly. I've been cooperating my whole life, he said. The results never seemed to change. And with that, he walked down the aisle, flanked by security. The plane didn't move. The passengers didn't speak. But everyone knew, something had just happened, and it wouldn't be the last. As Marcus stepped into the narrow corridor just outside the aircraft, the roar of jet engines became a dull echo behind the thick seal of the door. The 2 uniformed security officers flanked him silently, one tall and wiry, the other shorter with broad shoulders and thinning blonde hair. Neither of them looked at him directly. It wasn't hostility. It was the kind of bureaucratic discomfort that came with having to touch the wire without knowing who strung it. The taller one, identified by the silver badge as Officer R. Jennings, spoke first, clearing his throat as though the act of forming words might change the atmosphere. Mr. Harris, this will only take a moment. We just need to check your bag and confirm there's nothing out of place. Marcus said nothing. He adjusted the collar of his jacket, his expression unreadable. The air was colder out here, though that may have been the silence, not the temperature. They reached a small inspection area just off the jet bridge, a sterile counter surrounded by plexiglass. A third figure was already waiting there, a woman in her late 30s, black hair pinned back tightly in a professional bun, sharp green eyes scanning a digital tablet. Her name tag read Ops Specialist L. Nguyen. She wore the Navy Skylux blazer like armor and stood like she'd rather be anywhere else. Open the bag, Jennings said softly. Marcus placed the duffel on the counter with a calm that was starting to feel weaponized. The blonde officer slipped on gloves and unzipped the main compartment, revealing a neatly folded suit jacket, a brushed aluminum laptop, a slim leather binder, and a small bag of mixed cashews sealed in a clear Ziploc. Everything's accounted for, said the blonde one. Nguyen didn't look up from her tablet. Run the scanner, she said, voice flat. The officer ran a handheld device across the open bag. It beeped quietly, no alerts. Jennings nodded. All clear. Marcus exhaled once. As expected. Sir, Nguyen finally said, looking up at him now. Her gaze wasn't cold, but it wasn't apologetic either. This is protocol. It's not personal. Marcus held her eyes. That line works better when protocol is applied consistently. Nguyen said nothing. Her hand paused mid-scroll. With practiced fingers, Marcus reached into the binder and pulled out a single document, a printed itinerary signed by his assistant, time-stamped with every meeting he'd had over the past 72 hours. He set it gently on the counter, beside his laptop. Since we're on the subject of protocols, he said quietly, I'd like to request a record of cabin crew assignments and internal incident logs for Flight 716. You can relay that directly to your legal liaison. The request is being mirrored internally. Gwyn blinked once. Jennings looked at her. She gave a subtle nod. We'll log that, Jennings said quickly. And we appreciate your cooperation, Mr. Harris. Marcus zipped up his bag with precision, slung it back over his shoulder, and turned toward the boarding door. Meanwhile, back inside the aircraft, the atmosphere had shifted. Melissa, the younger attendant with soft brown curls pulled into a bouncy ponytail, stood by the galley, wringing her hands. She was 25 tops, skin like porcelain, and a tendency to chew on her lower lip when nervous. Her eyes darted between Rebecca and Caleb. Caleb, the male flight attendant, was tall, built like a former college athlete with a calm demeanor that could quiet a rowdy cabin. He was now whispering into the wall intercom, likely reporting the delay and requesting discretion from the gate staff. But his eyes, dark and observant, kept returning to Rebecca. Rebecca Summers stood near the aisle like a statue carved from control and calculation. Her uniform impeccable, her makeup light but strategic, contour sharpening her already angular cheekbones, matte lipstick in a muted coral. She wasn't speaking now. She didn't need to. Her crossed arms and the pinched corners of her mouth screamed superiority, and something else, doubt, just beginning to flicker. Melissa shifted her weight and dared to speak. Do you think maybe we went too far? Rebecca didn't answer right away. Her nails tapped against her iPad screen, even though it was off. He was hostile, she said finally. Was he? Caleb asked, tone mild but sharp. He refused to cooperate. He asked a question, Caleb replied, and he was right to ask it. Rebecca's jaw tightened. We followed procedure. A silence stretched too long. Across the aisle, Daniel Tran sat with his tray table down, laptop open, though he hadn't typed in 10 minutes. Daniel was Vietnamese-American, early 40s, slight frame, neatly pressed gray blazer over a black turtleneck. His glasses perched low on his nose, eyes focused but unfocused, lost in memory. 10 minutes before the woman in 1C had gasped about the missing watch. Daniel had seen something. A blur at first, just a flash of rose gold in the gloved hand of Grace, one of the junior attendants. She had been moving quickly toward the galley. At the time, he had assumed it was found and being returned. But when Marcus was confronted and publicly shamed, that memory began to itch like a splinter. Daniel's hands hovered over his keyboard. He opened a new draft in his email. Subject: Passenger Observation, Flight 716. In the seat beside him, a teenager with over-ear headphones tapped away on her phone, oblivious to the storm brewing in adult spaces. Back near the cockpit, Grace Dalton, the junior attendant in question, stood with her back to the galley curtain. She was no more than 23, strawberry blonde hair in a practical braid, cheeks flushed from the stress. Her hands trembled slightly as she rechecked the coffee pots, even though no one had ordered anything. She had seen the look in Rebecca's eyes when Marcus boarded. She had also held the watch before any complaint was made. She hadn't agreed with what happened next. But she hadn't stopped it either. And that was beginning to feel like betrayal. She heard footsteps, measured, deliberate. Marcus re-entered the cabin. He moved like nothing had happened, which somehow made it worse. People watched him more openly now. Some out of curiosity. Some out of guilt. Others, out of a primal discomfort with seeing dignity survive where it should have shattered. Marcus returned to his seat in 2A. On his tray table was a crumpled note, Jada's drawing. Someone had retrieved it and placed it back. He smoothed the paper flat, the crayon letters barely legible but loaded with weight. Across from him, the woman in 1B looked up from her phone. They still haven't apologized, huh? She murmured. Marcus gave her a look, not annoyed, not grateful. Just human. No, he said simply. They rarely do. At the front of the cabin, Rebecca whispered something into her tablet, pretending to work. But Grace was already moving toward her. The plane had not moved. Outside, the jet bridge remained connected, a metal limb refusing to let go. Inside, time seemed to stretch thin and uncertain. Conversations had reduced to whispers. Even the air felt heavier. In seat 3A, Gerald Whitmore, the silver-haired executive who earlier muttered about Marcus's cooperation, now sat rigidly, his legs crossed in precise angles, fingers curled over the edges of his tablet. He hadn't looked up since Marcus returned. His eyes stared blankly at a paused screen, an outdated stock chart he hadn't touched in 20 minutes. He wasn't scrolling. He was hiding. Across the aisle, Daniel Tran finished his email. The cursor blinked at the bottom of the screen, as if waiting for a final breath. He clicked send. Then he looked up. Grace Dalton stood halfway between the galley and Marcus's row, motionless. Her uniform looked a size too big, as if the shame she carried had shrunk her inside it. Her braid, once taut, had loosened at the base. She gripped a paper cup of water in both hands, trembling slightly. She took a breath and walked, quiet, careful, her shoes nearly silent on the carpet. Stopping beside Rebecca, she whispered, "We need to talk." Rebecca Summers didn't turn. Her eyes remained fixed on her tablet, though her fingers were frozen. The posture, the ironclad calm she had worn like a tailored jacket, was starting to sag. "What is it?" she murmured, low but firm. "That man," Grace swallowed. "The one in 2A. He just made a call outside. He mentioned Anderson Group Legal." Rebecca finally looked up. Her brown eyes, always sharp, darted toward Marcus, who now sat reclined with quiet control, scanning his phone. His leather wallet rested on his tray table, just slightly open. Inside, Grace had seen it earlier, a card she had recognized before her body knew what to do. "You know what that means, right?" Grace asked. Rebecca scoffed. "It means he's bluffing. They always bluff. What's he going to do? File a Yelp review?" "No," Grace said, shaking her head, eyes wide now. "He's not bluffing. He's connected." "That wasn't a threat. That was protocol." Rebecca exhaled through her nose. "You're overreacting." Grace leaned in. "Rebecca, he owns part of the company." The words hung in the air like dropped glass. In the galley, Caleb, the male flight attendant with broad shoulders and trimmed beard, turned from the intercom. He'd been monitoring updates from flight operations. The channel had gone strangely quiet after receiving word that Marcus Harris had invoked internal protocol. He moved toward Rebecca, his footsteps measured. "The captain wants to speak with you," he said quietly. "Now." Rebecca's mask cracked for the first time, just a twitch of her left brow. She handed Grace the tablet without a word and walked toward the front cabin. Caleb turned to Grace, his voice softer. "Are you okay?" "I knew about the watch," she whispered, "before she made the accusation. I saw it in the lounge. Someone turned it in, and I brought it to Rebecca." Caleb's face stiffened. "What did she say?" he asked. "She said she had a feeling." "That he was too confident," Grace replied, biting her lower lip. Behind them, the cockpit door opened. Captain Ray Delaney, a tall, salt and pepper man with thick eyebrows and a crease between them that never left, even in good weather, stepped out. He moved like someone used to turbulence, but today he looked rattled. Behind him trailed a young man in a reflective airport vest. Operations Officer Nolan, barely 30, breathless, clutching a clipboard like a life raft. They leaned toward Rebecca, who had stepped just inside the galley. The captain's voice was low but distinct to the nearby rows. "Is it true?" he asked. Rebecca opened her mouth. "We had a theft report." "I didn't ask about the report," Delaney interrupted, tone iron flat. "Is it true you accused him without cause?" "There was circumstantial." "Stop," he said. "Just stop talking." She blinked, stunned. Meanwhile, in seat 2A, Marcus slowly reached into his jacket and removed a black metal ID card. He set it gently beside his phone, angled just enough for nearby passengers to read. A whisper bloomed like a ripple. "That's Skybridge Holdings," someone muttered 2 rows behind. "Wait, he's on the board?" "No, he owns the board seat." Caleb, now standing near the aisle, caught sight of the card and froze mid-step. Brendan Ellis, the director of communications, clean-shaven, sharp-suited, and sweating just beneath his silk tie, had entered moments earlier. He spotted the card, paled visibly, and turned to the cockpit. The intercom chimed. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be experiencing a brief delay," said a neutral voice. "We appreciate your patience." In 1C, the woman who first cried about her lost Cartier watch now sat completely still. Her posture had changed. No longer upright. She had folded inward, knees close, arms tight, eyes darting anywhere but toward Marcus. Across from her, the woman from 1B, the one who recorded the earlier scene, tilted her phone back on. Just in case. Marcus tapped on his device again. He didn't speak. Didn't need to. Grace, now trembling in place, turned to Brendan Ellis. "Sir," she said, her voice barely audible. He called the chairman line. He invoked privacy release on internal recordings. Ellis's face tightened. "Do we have surveillance audio?" "We do," Grace said. The forward mic was active. "Patch it," he muttered. "Into the cabin display. Let them hear it." Brendan walked to Marcus. "Sir," he said with forced composure, "do you authorize playback?" Marcus looked up. "Do it." Seconds later, the seatback screens flickered. Confused murmurs echoed across the cabin. Then the first sentence played, "I don't care if he has a ticket. He's not the kind of guy that sits in first class." Rebecca's voice. Cold. Disdainful. "He's too polished. Too confident. Something's off." A passenger gasped. Another covered their mouth. Then a video clip. Rebecca walking toward Marcus, asking for his ticket, her dismissive tone. Then, her in the galley whispering to Grace, "Just stall him. Make it look official. If we find something, great. If not, he'll think twice next time." The footage ended. The cabin fell into silence, so thick it could be sliced. Brendan stepped back. "Captain," he whispered, "you should speak now." But it was Marcus who rose instead. Marcus didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The silence that had swallowed the cabin after the surveillance footage now pulsed like a held breath. Passengers sat stiffly in their leather cocoons, blinking but unmoving, as though afraid that a single motion might draw the spotlight their way. He stood from seat 2A, folding the child's drawing in half and tucking it into his inner pocket with care. His frame, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in navy wool and quiet confidence, seemed to grow more commanding, not in size, but in gravity. The kind of presence that couldn't be taught, only earned. He turned toward the front of the cabin. "I assume no further proof is required," he said, voice measured, carrying not volume but weight. No one answered. No one could. Brendan Ellis, the director of communications, stood near the galley, lips parted as though waiting for a script that never came. His usually crisp suit now looked slightly wilted at the collar, a thin sheen of sweat collecting under his temples. Behind him, Captain Ray Delaney adjusted his hat under one arm. His tall frame and weathered face betrayed decades of experience, but at this moment, even he looked like a man navigating unfamiliar turbulence. "I'll be needing the full employee conduct logs for the past 60 days, Marcus continued, "as well as immediate documentation of this incident, submitted to oversight under full transparency clauses." Brendan swallowed hard. "Yes, sir. I'll handle it personally." "Not personally," Marcus corrected. "Officially. This isn't a PR mess. This is an audit." At the edge of the galley, Rebecca Summers stood paralyzed. Her figure, once poised and commanding in her tailored navy skirt suit, now seemed brittle. The rouge on her cheekbones sat too loud under the cold overhead lights. Her arms remained crossed, but her fingers were clenched white around her tablet. She looked at Marcus as though still searching for the exit in a room that had no door. She took a shaky half-step forward. "Mr. Harris," she began. He didn't even look at her. "You weren't aware. That's the point." She stopped. "You acted on instinct," Marcus said, eyes scanning the cabin. "On assumption, on unchecked bias. And that," his gaze finally landed on her, "is why this isn't just about me." No one moved. Even the passengers who had earlier averted their eyes now stared directly at her. The smirking man in 3A now held his face in his hands. The woman in 1C had begun to tear up quietly, her pride collapsing in upon itself. Grace Dalton, standing near the jump seat, clutched a clipboard to her chest. Her strawberry blonde braid had begun to fray loose, and a faint flush crept up her pale cheeks. She didn't say a word, but her wide eyes never left Marcus. Marcus turned slightly, facing Brendan. "As of now," he said, "I'm activating Field Compliance Directive CR 19 under Skybridge Holdings. That includes staff conduct assessment, protocol review, and cabin transparency reevaluation." Brendan nodded once, stiffly. "Understood." A ripple passed through the crew. Caleb, the tall male attendant with calm eyes and close-cropped curls, stood upright near the rear bulkhead. His lips pressed into a line, not fear, not guilt, but solemnity. A kind of vindication that came from watching truth win its ground. From behind the curtain, Operations Officer Nolan returned with a soft knock against the cockpit door. A moment later, Captain Delaney stepped out again. His voice, when he spoke, was steady. "MS. Summers," he said, without looking at her. "Under executive directive, your employment with Skylux Airlines is terminated effective immediately." The cabin inhaled. "You are to disembark this aircraft," the captain continued, "under escort, pending legal review." Rebecca blinked. Once. Twice. Her mouth opened, but no sound emerged. Two airport security agents, new ones, not the ones who escorted Marcus earlier, boarded swiftly through the still-connected jet bridge. One was a stocky black woman with short-cropped hair and intense eyes named Officer Raina Fields. The other, a lanky man with a close-shaved beard, wore a neon vest that read Gate OPS/Protocol Enforcement. Rebecca turned slowly, like someone realizing too late they were the last to leave a burning room. She removed her name badge, hands shaking, and placed it on the tray near her jump seat. Then, without looking at Marcus, she walked toward the exit. No applause followed. No jeers. Just the hush of collective consequence. The jet bridge door hissed shut behind her. In seat 2A, Marcus sat again, his expression unreadable. A moment later, the intercom chimed once more. "Dear passengers," came a new voice, calm, almost apologetic. "Skylux Airlines will be issuing digital incident forms to all individuals on board for optional statement submission. Submissions will be reviewed by an external oversight committee." In 4B, Daniel Tran, neatly dressed as always, glasses slightly tilted from adjusting them too often, opened his laptop again. He had more to say. Now he had the space to say it. In the back row of first class, Gerald Whitmore, the smug executive from earlier, quietly slipped off his gold cufflinks and stuffed them into his pocket like contraband. Near the galley, Grace placed a fresh bottle of water on Marcus's tray. Her voice, when it came, trembled with sincerity. "Thank you," she whispered, "for not staying silent." Marcus looked at her, not with forgiveness, not yet, but with a kind of acknowledgement that said, "You chose a different path when it mattered." And that counted. The captain returned to the cockpit. Brendan remained standing. "Mr. Harris," he said quietly now, "will issue a formal offer for damages, both procedural and reputational. It'll be drafted upon landing." Marcus didn't answer. He opened his phone again and began typing. A new message titled CR-19. Phase 2 personnel review initiated. The engines began to hum again. For the first time in an hour, the aircraft felt like a plane again. But for those who had watched everything unfold, it had already traveled farther than any flight plan could chart. The aircraft had begun to move. A soft mechanical hum signaled pushback from the gate. But inside, no one was thinking about takeoff. Not really. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the sun lowered behind the terminal glass. Shadows stretched across first class, casting long stripes over tray tables and polished shoes. It felt less like a flight, more like the aftermath of a verdict. In 4B, Daniel Tran sat straighter than before. His laptop now balanced on his knees, screen bright in the dimming cabin. He had already submitted one incident report, but it hadn't stopped gnawing at him. Something was unfinished. Daniel was slight and deliberate, with a face that always looked like it was mid-calculation. His salt and pepper hair was neatly parted to the side, his light gray jacket crisp despite the tension. He adjusted his glasses again and opened a new document. Not an official report this time, just memory. Because something had surfaced. 10 minutes before the woman in 1C screamed about her missing watch, Daniel had noticed a detail. He hadn't thought much of it then, but now it was starting to burn. He remembered standing in line at the boarding gate, sipping lukewarm coffee from a paper cup. Grace Dalton, the young flight attendant with pale skin, nervous energy, and a loosely braided ponytail, had passed him quickly, headed back toward the crew area. In her gloved hand, unmistakably, was a rose gold watch. A Cartier. Daniel remembered the way it caught the overhead light. At the time, he assumed it was just found property, being returned or logged. But the more he thought about it, the more it didn't add up. She had that watch before 1C said anything. And if that was true, then the accusation wasn't just impulsive. It was premeditated. Daniel glanced down the aisle. Grace stood near the rear galley now, posture slightly hunched, shoulders curled inward like she was folding in on herself. Her pale cheeks were flushed, and her hands twisted the edge of a cloth napkin again and again. She looked like she hadn't breathed in 10 minutes. Daniel closed his laptop, stood, and walked toward her. "Excuse me," he said softly, so as not to startle her. Grace turned anyway, wide-eyed, as though being spoken to had pulled her from underwater. Her features were delicate, small, pointed chin. Large greenish-hazel eyes that seemed too young for this kind of pressure. "Can I help you, sir?" she asked, her voice brittle. Daniel offered a small, respectful nod. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think I saw something before all this happened. I think I saw you holding the Cartier watch. Before the passenger in 1C reported it missing." Grace's breath caught. She looked around instinctively, checking if anyone had heard. Caleb was busy assisting in business class. Brendan Ellis was back in the cockpit area. The captain hadn't reappeared. She looked back at Daniel, eyes already welling. "Yes," she whispered. "It was the same one." "So it was found," Daniel pressed gently. "Before she said anything?" Grace nodded once. A passenger turned it in. 1C left it in the lounge before boarding. She was distracted. Someone found it, handed it to me. I brought it to Rebecca. Daniel inhaled slowly. So why? Grace hesitated, then glanced toward the front of the plane, where Rebecca had stood just 20 minutes earlier. So firm, so sure, so rehearsed. She said she had a feeling, Grace said quietly, that he was up to something. She didn't say who he was, but she didn't have to. She just decided. Daniel's jaw clenched, not in anger, but in recognition. This wasn't caution, he said. It was profiling. I didn't agree with it, Grace said. But I didn't stop her either. Daniel didn't speak for a moment. His eyes settled on hers, gentle but direct. You still can. She looked down at her hands. What good would it do now? He already saw everything. Everyone did. Daniel shook his head. Justice isn't about sparing his feelings. It's about making the truth undeniable. About what happens next. Grace nodded slowly. Something shifted in her posture, not fully upright, but no longer folded. I'll talk to him, she said. Daniel offered a soft, almost fatherly smile. Good. And make sure someone hears it, who can't ignore it this time. As Daniel returned to his seat, Grace turned and moved slowly up the aisle. Marcus was seated, typing something on his phone. He didn't look up until she stopped beside him. She hesitated, then spoke. I knew the watch wasn't missing, she said softly. It was turned in. I gave it to Rebecca myself. I'm so sorry I didn't say something earlier. I should have. Marcus looked at her. Not startled. Not even surprised. Why now? He asked, not unkindly. Grace took a breath. Because I don't want to be the kind of person who lets fear excuse silence. A long moment passed. You're not, Marcus said finally. Not anymore. Behind them, Caleb stood watching, one hand resting lightly on the bulkhead, eyes thoughtful. He said nothing, but the nod he gave Grace as she turned back was one of quiet pride. In the cockpit, Brendan Ellis had just received a secure ping on his tablet. Incident log update, passenger witness confession logged. He looked toward the cabin, blinking slowly, then began typing an addendum to the preliminary report. Crew member Grace Dalton confirmed prior possession of alleged missing item. No theft occurred. Original accusation made despite contrary evidence. In 3A, Gerald Whitmore, the executive who had once smirked, now sat still, knees together, hands in lap. He looked decades older than he had at takeoff. In 1B, the young woman with the earbuds who had filmed earlier quietly opened her camera again, not to record but to rewatch, to relive the moment a truth refused to be buried. The hum of the engines was steady now, but the tension inside the cabin still hadn't released. If anything, it had matured, no longer the taut discomfort of confusion, but the dense stillness of consequence settling into bone. Marcus sat in seat 2A, fingers moving with swift precision across his phone. His leather wallet remained closed beside him now, its dark edge catching the light. The folded drawing from his daughter, Good Luck Daddy, was tucked safely back into his inner pocket, though its presence radiated like armor. He wasn't logging emotions. He was building timelines. Screenshots. Names. Phrases. Actions and inactions. Every moment, every silence, every escalation. This wasn't revenge. It was documentation. Evidence for change. 2 rows ahead, Brendan Ellis, the director of communications for Skylux Airlines, paced near the galley, tablet in hand, lips drawn tight into a pale line. The man had begun the flight with the easy assurance of a company fixer, tailored navy suit, pocket square tucked just so, loafers polished mirror sharp. Now, under the fluorescent cabin lights, his collar was unbuttoned, and his brow glistened under the weight of executive dread. He was no longer managing a PR incident. He was managing survival. Brendan's tablet buzzed, a new message. Directive Alpha clearance confirmed. Oversight inbound. Hold aircraft. He looked up, eyes searching for Marcus like a student awaiting judgment. At the rear of first class, Grace Dalton stood with her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Her face, pale as a porcelain mug, still carried the shimmer of barely dried tears. But her shoulders were no longer hunched. She wasn't hiding anymore. From the aisle, Caleb, the tall flight attendant with rich brown skin and thoughtful eyes, nodded at her gently before stepping forward. He approached Brendan and spoke in a hushed tone. Sir, passengers are starting to ask what's happening. Brendan exhaled. We're stabilizing the cabin shortly. Legal's on the ground. Caleb arched a brow. Legal's here? Before Brendan could answer, the aircraft door reopened. A gasp ran through the cabin like wind cutting across a frozen lake. A tall man stepped on board, moving with precise, almost military rhythm. He wore a charcoal three-piece suit, the Skylux lapel pin glinting on his collar. His skin was dark olive, hair salt and pepper parted sharply. His presence was unmistakably high-ranking. This was David Qasim, Chief Operations Officer of Skylux Airlines. Behind him followed a woman in her early 40s, black suit dress, square glasses, and a sleek black digital tablet. Her expression was unreadable, her movements practiced and tight. Her badge read S. Lennox Internal Compliance. Passengers whispered now, not about Marcus, but about the presence of power. Brendan stepped forward. "Sir." Qasim raised a hand without looking at him. He scanned the cabin and spoke directly to Marcus. "Mr. Harris," he said, his voice deep and impeccably even. "We're here to address the situation personally." Marcus didn't stand. He simply nodded once. Qasim turned to Lennox. "Begin internal verification protocol." Lennox nodded and moved to the galley. She tapped open a secured app on her tablet, syncing with the aircraft's black box surveillance and audio logs. Then she turned, facing the crew. "All communications between flight staff will be reviewed in full," she announced flatly. "Any deletions or omissions post-incident are subject to regulatory violation." The crew stiffened. Grace looked at Caleb. He gave her a silent nod. She took one step forward and raised her hand gently. "I've already submitted a formal confession," she said. Her voice trembled at first, then steadied. "I saw the watch before boarding. It was turned in by another passenger. Rebecca knew. She escalated anyway." Lennox's face didn't move, but her fingers flew across the screen. "Testimony logged," she said. Then she turned to Marcus. "Mr. Harris, would you prefer a closed-door debrief?" Marcus shook his head. "What needs to be heard should be heard by everyone who watched it happen." There was a kind of collective stillness after that, like air being held between moments. David Qasim stepped forward again. "On behalf of Skylux Airlines," he said slowly, "I want to offer our sincerest apologies, not just for the misconduct of our staff, but for the culture that allowed it to happen." Marcus met his gaze. "Apologies without accountability are branding." Qasim nodded. "We agree. That's why we've begun an internal audit of crew profiling complaints logged over the last 18 months. Every incident. Every name." He turned to Brendan, who looked stunned. "From now until the audit is complete, no crew member involved in this incident will be assigned to a flight. Terminations will be reviewed for all supervisory staff who enabled policy misuse." Caleb blinked. So did Melissa, the younger flight attendant who had said little but observed everything. Her ponytail now looked frayed, her eyes wide with quiet realization. Marcus leaned slightly forward, not to command attention, but to set the next tone. "You've built a system that confuses confidence for threat," he said, "and it rewards fear disguised as caution." Lennox was still typing, but her eyes flicked toward him. Qasim listened without interruption. "I've been gathering complaints, incident data, and internal accounts for months," Marcus continued. "What I needed was one live, observable event. You gave it to me. Efficiently." Qasim's brow furrowed slightly, but he didn't interrupt. "This plane," Marcus said, voice steady, became a courtroom. "But what's more important is what it becomes when we land." He looked toward the passengers, many of whom now sat quietly ashamed. Others nodded. Even Gerald Whitmore in 3A kept his head down, clutching his tablet like a confessional booth. Qasim took a breath. "Then you'll be pleased to know. As of this moment, we're launching the Equity Navigation Division, an independent oversight task force to handle not only this incident, but to transform how we train and monitor conduct. We would like your guidance." Marcus was quiet for a beat. "Then, you'll get it, but only if transparency is non-negotiable." "Agreed," Qasim said. In the cockpit, the captain, who had observed all silently, adjusted his headset and finally spoke into the radio. "Tower, this is Flight 716. We are now ready for taxi." The wheels began to roll. The plane had lifted into the clouds, but the cabin hadn't yet exhaled. There was a strange, sacred quiet in the air, not the hush of sleep or the dull murmur of altitude, but the kind of collective stillness that came after something real had taken place. A truth too sharp to ignore. Something heavy had shifted. It hadn't just passed through them, it had cut through them. Marcus remained in seat 2A, his hands no longer typing, but resting. For the first time in an hour, his posture was still, not tense, not guarded. Just steady. balanced, like a man who had finally passed through fire and found ground. His expression was unreadable, but his presence was unmistakable. Tall, composed, with the natural gravity of someone who didn't speak unless every word mattered. A soft chime rang through the speakers. Then Brendan Ellis's voice. Ladies and gentlemen, we recognize today's flight has not proceeded as expected. On behalf of Skylux Airlines, we thank you for your patience during ongoing internal reviews. Updates regarding today's incident will be communicated through official channels. There was something hollow in the tone. It was the voice of someone trying to regain control after they'd lost the room. But before the intercom clicked off, another voice cut in. Brendan, the captain's voice said, calm and steady. He wants to speak. There was a pause. Then Brendan's voice again, softer now, more human. Mr. Harris, the floor is yours. Marcus stood. Not rushed. Not dramatic. Just deliberate. He stepped into the narrow aisle. For a man of his stature, over 6 feet, broad-shouldered, with dark skin that gleamed slightly in the cabin light, there was no blending in. He didn't try to. He didn't shrink or soften. He just spoke. Not to the front. Not to the back. To everyone. What you saw today, Marcus began, voice low but resonant, isn't new. No one shifted. Not a single cough or seatbelt click interrupted him. It didn't start with me, and it won't end with her. He let the silence breathe. But today it changes. Near the front, Grace Dalton had paused mid-pour of a water cup. Her hands were still. Her eyes locked on him. Because today, for once, it happened in front of people who couldn't pretend it didn't. A quiet murmur rippled through the cabin. Not outrage. Not fear. Recognition. In the air, Marcus continued, there are no exits. No streets to walk away from. No camera angles to avoid. No back rooms to sweep things under. He turned slightly, meeting eyes row by row. You saw what it looks like when suspicion replaces evidence. When uniform replaces accountability. When skin replaces standard. Daniel Tran, seated with his hands folded over his laptop, nodded faintly. Injustice thrives in silence, Marcus said, and silence thrives in comfort. But the moment that comfort is shaken, suddenly people pay attention. The man in 3A, Gerald Whitmore, now sat with his arms folded in a completely different posture, no longer smug. No longer sure. Just listening. Marcus's tone didn't rise. He wasn't a preacher. He wasn't a politician. He was a witness and a reckoner. I was never supposed to be a moment, he said. I was supposed to be invisible, replaceable, containable. He took a breath, slow and deep. But instead, I became an example. He paused, then turned toward the cockpit. I'm submitting a formal motion to Skylux Internal. Removal of any staff whose conduct violates the equity charter of this airline. That begins with the crew member formerly known as Rebecca Summers. There were no cheers. No applause. Just that same silent agreement that had filled the cabin since the video was played. Justice didn't need a crescendo. It needed a commitment. And it continues, Marcus said, with an investigation into all current training modules, incident reports, and passenger profiling complaints submitted over the last 5 years. All of it. All of them. At the galley, Brendan Ellis leaned against the wall, hand covering his mouth, like someone standing in the aftermath of a courtroom verdict. Across from Marcus, the young woman in 1B, the one who had filmed the confrontation early on, spoke softly to the person beside her. That's real leadership, she said. That's what it looks like. Grace stepped forward now, hands unclasped. I want to say something. Marcus turned slightly. So did Kasim, still seated behind him. Grace's braid was no longer pristine. Her name tag had come slightly loose. But she didn't care. I was silent because I was scared. And then I remembered he wasn't. Her voice shook. But it carried. I've worked here for 2 years. I've watched how we treat certain passengers. I've laughed at things I should have challenged. I've called it protocol when it was prejudice. She looked at Marcus. I don't want to be that kind of employee anymore. Someone near the back murmured. Not mockery, respect. Grace sat back down. Kasim stood. His charcoal suit looked even sharper in contrast to the sweat on Brendan's collar. Mr. Harris, he said, your testimony, your documentation, and your voice will serve as the foundation for our new Equity Navigation Division. Marcus didn't smile, but something in his shoulders softened. Then it's only fair that the first official action from that division, Marcus said, is to issue a public acknowledgement. Not just to me, but to every passenger on this flight who watched what bias looks like when it thinks no one important is watching. Qasim nodded. Approved. Brendan stepped forward, holding a sealed envelope. For damages, he said softly. Procedural and reputational. $750,000. Processed upon landing. Marcus didn't even glance at it. Send it, he said, to the Freedom to Move Foundation. Brendan blinked. You don't want it for yourself? Marcus shook his head. I didn't come here for a check. I came for change. And in that moment, without music, without marketing, something historic had occurred. One man stood, and the culture of a corporation began to kneel. 3 weeks had passed since Flight 716 landed. It hadn't just arrived at a destination, it had detonated in the public conscience. The surveillance footage, the words, the disdain, the evidence, had leaked before Marcus even touched his front door. Within 48 hours, major networks were looping the incident. Flight attendant fired after racial profiling scandal became the headline that refused to die. And yet, the man at the center of it all had disappeared from public view. Marcus Harris didn't take interviews, didn't post statements. He left the microphone on the floor where corporate damage control had tried to pick it up. Instead, he sent a letter. No press header, no signature block, just his handwriting. It was folded into a plain envelope and delivered to a modest apartment on the outskirts of Chicago. Inside lived Rebecca Summers. She had lost everything: job, reputation, future offers. Her name had become a case study in every HR seminar from Boston to San Francisco. But none of it compared to the envelope on her kitchen table. She had opened it cautiously. Inside were 82 words that would change her life. You misjudged me, but I won't do the same to you. Consequences were necessary. But cruelty is not justice. If you're ready to unlearn and rebuild, there's a program I help fund. It's rigorous, uncomfortable, but it leads somewhere better. You're invited, if you want to begin again. There was no name signed, but she didn't need one. She enrolled 3 days later. The following months weren't kind. The program, designed for professionals recovering from bias-driven misconduct, wasn't therapy, it was confrontation. Reverse simulations, blind spot testing, dialogue immersion with passengers who had lived through decades of profiling. There were tears, walkouts, and moments when Rebecca nearly dropped out. But she didn't. Somewhere between the 3rd and 4th week, she stopped defending herself. She started listening. And by the 7th, she started speaking differently. Not just about what she saw, but how she had learned to see. Meanwhile, Skylux Airlines underwent structural surgery. The Equity Navigation Division, led by a 5-member board of internal and external experts, rolled out in full, with Marcus Harris named as its strategic advisor. Training modules were rewritten. Complaint systems were rebuilt. Anonymous reports were now routed through third-party ombuds services. The word bias was no longer a taboo in training manuals. It was a measured metric in company KPIs. Grace Dalton, formerly the timid flight attendant with green hazel eyes and a loosened braid, was promoted to junior officer of inclusion and training oversight. She worked behind the scenes in the very division Marcus helped found. Her voice, once small, had become purposeful. She no longer walked quickly to avoid the truth. She walked toward it. It was in that spirit that she stood near the stage of a modest conference center in downtown Chicago, clipboard in hand, heart hammering behind her ribs. The Global Equity in Aviation Summit was not glamorous. The coffee was too bitter, the lighting was too yellow, and the folding chairs creaked. But every seat was filled. Grace glanced at the final name on the speaker list, Rebecca Summers. She hadn't known until yesterday that Rebecca would be there. The host, a calm woman in a navy pantsuit, stepped up to the mic. Our final speaker brings a story of consequence, correction, and growth, she said. Please welcome Rebecca Summers. Silence. Then slow, uncertain applause. Rebecca walked to the podium, not in designer heels, but in flat black shoes and a gray blazer that looked borrowed. Her blonde hair was tied back. Her face bore no makeup, only honesty. She didn't read from notes. My name is Rebecca, she said, and I'm here because I failed. The room stilled. I failed not just as an employee. I failed as a person. I thought following policy meant I couldn't be wrong. That doing my job meant I didn't have bias. I was wrong. She looked at Grace. Someone gave me a second chance, not with words, but with opportunity. They didn't excuse me. They invited me to do the work. And it's the hardest thing I've ever done. She paused. But it's also the first thing I've done that truly matters. This time, the applause came quicker, warmer. Not for perfection, but for change earned the hard way. After the session, Grace approached her. The two women stood for a moment without speaking, then embraced, not awkwardly but meaningfully. They had stood on opposite ends of the same storm. Now they stood inside its clearing. Across the country, in a quiet Brooklyn neighborhood, Marcus Harris walked hand in hand with his daughter, Jada. She was 8. Bright eyes, braided pigtails, and a backpack nearly too big for her. They passed a newsstand. A folded newspaper in the corner displayed a small column headline: Former flight attendant speaks on bias, credits second chance as turning point. Jada looked up. Daddy, did you help her? Marcus smiled faintly. He adjusted her strap. Maybe, he said, but only because she chose to help herself. They crossed the street. The sun wasn't dramatic. The air wasn't different. But the world was just a little. Because of one flight. Because of one man who didn't stay seated.